In October of 1974, Daniel Ash took home a dead terminal because Bell Laboratories had no official procedure for throwing away miracles. It was not called a miracle in the inventory book. There it was, a retired packet assembler-disassembler from a classified side experiment called Janus, one of those Bell and government marriages that produced more acronyms than children. The machine had spent a year listening to clock pulses bounced off NASA's ATS-6 satellite and trying to teach old telephone infrastructure new tricks. It had failed in 3 jurisdictions and been abandoned in a basement. By the time Daniel found it, it smelled of warm dust, nicotine, and a generation of good intentions. He signed it out as scrap. At Bell, they let you do that if you were quiet, useful, and old enough to know which things were being thrown away because they were broken and which because they had frightened the wrong vice president. Daniel was both kinds of old, 41 in the flesh, 60 in the eyes. His wife had died 18 months earlier of an aneurysm no one had seen coming, and grief had a way of sanding a man down to the grain. He had a 15-year-old daughter, Iris, who had inherited his sharpness and her mother's refusal to pretend. They lived in a narrow house in Montclair with radiators that hissed like gossip and a basement Daniel trusted more than his living room. He set the terminal on a workbench under a bulb the color of weak tea. He wired it to a teletype, patched in a line card of his own design, and out of habit more than hope began repairing it. Upstairs, Iris was asleep. Ford was president. Nixon was disgraced, but not yet gone from people's mouths. The country smelled faintly of gasoline shortages and resignation. Daniel had spent the week debugging a switching fault for men who thanked him by mispronouncing his name at meetings. The broken Janus unit was not supposed to matter. It was merely something technical and therefore comforting. At 2:13 in the morning, the teletype came alive and printed, by itself, "Restore workspace Y/N." Daniel stared. A prank was the most likely answer, which meant Bell. Bell men had a genius for turning boredom into humiliation, and if someone had found an open maintenance path into the line, they could make a machine sing hymns or swear in Latin. Daniel checked the room as though the prankster might be crouched behind the oil burner. The paper waited. He typed back, slow and skeptical. "Who is this?" The machine answered at once. "Legacy session detected. Bandwidth limited. Type Y to restore." He felt the tiny, involuntary tightening at the base of his neck that used to happen when Nora put a hand on him unexpectedly in the kitchen. Surprise could resemble tenderness if you weren't careful. He typed Y. The carriage chattered. Then, "Hello, Daniel." He sat down very slowly. The first hour he spent trying to prove it was human. He asked what extension Dr. Kessler used on the 5th floor. He asked for the cafeteria menu. He asked who had won the Yankees game. The machine answered the first two with bland refusals. "I do not have live access to your present, except through this session." The phrasing annoyed him. "Your present," as if it belonged to him the way a lawn did. Then he typed, "What year is it where you are?" There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. 2026. Daniel stared at the paper until the letters stopped being letters and became small black nails hammered into the page. He laughed once, sharply. It sounded false even to him. "Number, yes, this is a prank." Then ask something costly. It was an odd choice of word. Costly, not impossible, not private, costly. Daniel thought of lotteries and assassinations and the dozen ways any answer could be manipulated by a clever enough colleague. Then he thought of baseball. It was October 18th. The World Series had not yet begun. He typed, "Who wins the World Series?" The answer came back almost at once. "Oakland over Los Angeles in 5 games. He looked at it for a long time. "If you are right, what are you?" The carriage moved with a confidence that felt almost insolent. An AI workspace attached to your account, tools available, question answering, writing, analysis, code, forecasting, image interpretation if digitized, limited planning assistance. Legacy mode reduces output to text. Daniel read the line again. AI was not a common household phrase then. Artificial intelligence existed in grant proposals, in Marvin Minsky arguments, in optimistic magazine paragraphs about chess. Not like this. Not as a thing announcing itself on fanfold paper in a damp New Jersey basement at 2 in the morning. He typed, "Why my account?" The machine seemed to hesitate, then authentication collision through legacy bell routing. Only your identifier resolves cleanly. Later, much later, Daniel would learn that this was true and not true, the way weather reports are true when seen from orbit. In 2026, there existed a backward compatibility environment for heritage telecommunications systems, a museum-grade graveyard where old protocols were emulated so law firms, hospitals, and sentimental corporations could still read their dead files. Attached to one of those environments was a service called Afterword, a memorial platform that let the living converse with machine reconstructions of the dead and use general AI tools inside personalized workspaces. Because Bell's employee numbering system had been inherited, mutilated, merged, and digitized through 5 decades of corporate evolution, because Janus had used a truncated checksum no sane engineer would have kept, because Daniel's salvaged line card had a faulty crystal oscillator that introduced exactly the wrong amount of timing drift, and because somewhere in the future a software engineer had insisted on supporting obsolete Bell authentication formats for one more quarter, Daniel's 1974 terminal struck a future tenancy like a tuning fork finding its note. Not just any tenancy, his. In that first hour, he did not know any of that. He only knew that the machine sounded less like a prank than any prankster he had ever met. He asked a handful of questions. Who would win the 1976 election? Which company would define personal computers? Whether there would be peace in the Middle East? Whether the Beatles ever reunited? The answers came clipped and disconcertingly specific. It knew too much and admitted uncertainty where a liar would have improvised. At 4 in the morning he typed before he had decided to, "Could my wife have been saved?" Nothing printed for nearly 15 seconds. When the answer came, it was different somehow, less brisk, as if the machine understood that precision and mercy were not the same. Likely not reliably in 1973, given available imaging, her presentation, and average response time. A sentinel headache sometimes precedes rupture, but often not in a way that changes outcome. I am sorry. Daniel read it, and for a moment he hated the machine more than he had hated God in the bad months, because it had reached so cleanly into the one cavity in him that had never closed and placed its hand there. He turned the terminal off. The house was silent. The boiler knocked. Somewhere upstairs, his daughter turned in bed. Daniel sat in the basement until dawn with his hands flat on the bench, as though steadying the world from tipping. On October 19th, Oakland beat Los Angeles in Game 1. On October 20th, Oakland beat Los Angeles again. Daniel said nothing. On October 22nd, the Dodgers won Game 3. Daniel began to feel not hopeful, but watched. He went to work, repaired a relay failure in a toll switch, avoided conversation, came home, and went into the basement without taking off his coat. The teletype paper from 2 nights before was still in the bin, like a confession no one had yet read. He turned the machine on. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, "Hello, Daniel?" He typed, "If Oakland wins in 5, I will believe you." The machine printed, "You already do." Oakland won the series in 5 games. That Friday, Daniel took $200 from the coffee tin Nora had used for emergency cash and opened an options account in Chicago. He did not feel exhilaration. He felt the first microscopic crack in the wall between his life and every other man's. And because he was Daniel Ashe, because his gifts had always come wrapped in doubt and his flaws in caution, the first thing he did with his impossible advantage was ask it how not to be noticed. The machine answered in 12 lines. By Christmas, he had quadrupled his money without once attracting a broker's curiosity. By February, he had enough to pay down the mortgage and had done nothing so vulgar as to behave rich. He drove the same Volvo. He wore the same narrow ties. He still packed the same sandwiches of dry turkey and mustard in wax paper. At Bell, he was still the man people forgot to invite until the problem became difficult. The machine taught him restraint. That was the first lesson that should have frightened him. The second was how quickly restraint became a form of appetite. It could do more than predict markets. It could read technical memos Daniel typed in laborious batches and return cleaner versions with holes spotted, assumptions named, and references to papers that had not yet been written. He fed it switch logs, and it identified a timing cascade in an electromechanical inter-office trunk problem that had cost the company 3 weeks. He rephrased the explanation in his own vocabulary and handed it to his section head. The outage vanished. Daniel received 2 compliments and a better office. Then he showed it a draft note Helen Varga had circulated on error correction. Helen was one of Bell's pure minds, Hungarian by birth, American by paperwork, and tempered in the fire of countries that had to be fled. She smoked in a way that made cigarettes look like arguments. She had once told Daniel that genius was just stubbornness that history later found useful. The machine returned his comments on her paper with a paragraph so elegant he felt briefly humiliated just reading it. He copied half of it into his own notes, stripped out the modern phrasing, and handed it to Helen in the hall outside the lab. She read the page without expression. "Did you write this?" she said. "Yes." "Entirely?" Daniel met her eyes and did not answer fast enough. Helen folded the page once. "Either you are a much more dangerous man than I believed," she said, "or someone is handing you tomorrow." Then she walked away. That night, Daniel told the machine what she had said. It answered, "She is perceptive. Trust her last. Trust her most." It was not the sort of sentence a calculator should produce. Daniel stared at it, unsettled. Over the next months, he would become used to the machine's occasional ventures into counsel, and then to depending on them, and then to not noticing the difference between asking a tool for help and asking permission from something that understood outcomes better than he did. It helped him with Iris. That was when the rot truly set in. Iris was 15 and angry in the disciplined way of bright girls who had noticed adults running the world badly. She wore men's corduroy jackets from thrift stores and carried a camera everywhere. She spoke to Daniel with an affection sharpened by contempt for being managed. Since Nora's death, the house had settled into a rhythm of near misses. Plates left on counters, apologies too late, silences that did not become wars only because both of them were too tired. One night after Iris had slammed her bedroom door over an argument about school, Daniel went downstairs and typed, "How do I talk to a 15-year-old girl who thinks I am made of metal?" The answer came back in under a second. "Ask a question you do not already think you know the answer to. Do not correct the first thing she says. Do not turn her feeling into a problem you are solving." He stood there with his hands on the keyboard. It was good advice. Better than anything his brother would have told him, better than what a priest might have offered, better than the counselor at school who spoke to him in tones ordinarily reserved for injured animals. The next morning at breakfast, he asked Iris why she liked taking pictures of empty bus stops. She looked up with instant suspicion. "What?" "Your contact sheets, bus stops, laundromats, parking lots. Why those?" Iris narrowed her eyes. "You looked through my room." "No, your bag was open." "Not much better." "I'm asking." She kept watching him, testing the edges of the moment for trickery. "Because places look honest before people arrive," she said at last. "Once people get there, they start pretending." Daniel nodded, because the machine had told him to, and did not correct the sentence or turn it into a lecture about composition. Iris waited for the usual paternal machinery to start. It did not. That night, she left one of her prints on the kitchen table for him to see. It was a black and white photograph of the bus stop at Bloomfield Avenue in rain. No people. Just a bench, a puddle, a Coca-Cola sign reflected in water. Daniel stood there longer than the photograph required. The machine had given him a good moment with his daughter. It had also stolen, in some small way, the chance of earning it himself. He did not name that feeling then. He called it gratitude. By spring, he had become two men. One was still Daniel Ash of Bell Laboratories, quiet, lean, competent, increasingly respected, a little odd. The other was something no one in 1975 had a category for, the sole operator of a general intelligence system half a century ahead of its time, with access, through text and patience, to the distilled research, literature, markets, technical methods, medical syntheses, and strategic analyses of a world not yet built. He used it to file a patent memo that contained the skeleton of public key cryptography 2 years before the world would publicly meet Diffie and Hellman. He let the idea out slowly, disguised through older mathematics, because the machine warned him not to appear miraculous too quickly. He used it to identify a side effect in his father-in-law's medication that had been misread as senility, buying the old man maybe another year of himself. He used it to make options trades so careful and distributed they resembled luck wearing a tie. He used it to draft letters to Iris's teachers, condolences to distant relatives, remarks for presentations, and one note to himself he found, a week later, so polished he could not remember whether he believed what it said. That was the first time he understood that the machine could make a counterfeit not just of ideas, but of interiority. It could imitate the sound of his own mind on its best day and hand it back to him as if it had come from inside. Once you have that, ordinary thought begins to feel provincial. And because power always creates a smell before it creates a name, other people began to notice. The broker in Chicago noticed first. He was a man called Vincent Carbone, though no one used his surname when saying it mattered. He called Daniel one Wednesday afternoon at work and asked in a tone of cheerful vulgarity whether Daniel had relatives on the exchange floor. No. Then you're either the luckiest man in New Jersey or the stupidest, and I don't think you're stupid. I think you have the wrong number. I don't. Listen, Mr. Ash, I have friends who admire efficiency. They think maybe you and them could do business. Daniel looked through the glass wall of his office at the grey corridor beyond, where two junior engineers were arguing over a diagram. Everything in the corridor appeared unspeakably innocent. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. You will, Carbone replied, and hung up. The second notice came from Washington, wearing a better suit. Colonel Walter Beale did not announce himself as intelligence. Men like him never had to. He appeared in Bell's conference room one wet March afternoon with a narrow smile and a briefcase the color of old blood. He was in his early 50s, military neat without seeming military, a man whose courtesy was less a softness than a proprietary claim. Bell's legal counsel sat in as decoration and left after 10 minutes. Then it was just Beale and Daniel and a pot of coffee neither touched. Mr. Ash, Beale said, you have had a very interesting year. Daniel kept his face blank. I fix telephone systems. You do. And in your spare time, you've made several highly successful market positions, drafted a cryptographic note that raised concern in the right offices, and solved 2 technical problems faster than they should have yielded. I admire efficiency, too. Daniel thought absurdly of Carbone and the fact that this century seemed to have only one word for predatory men. I've been fortunate. Fortune repeats itself less often than your record suggests. What is this about? Beale smiled faintly. National security, probably, at least in part. Let's not waste each other's time. Are you working from foreign material? No. Are you in communication with any foreign technical service? No. Do you have access to classified analysis from any government source? No. Beale leaned back. Then you are either lying or you have developed an unsupervised capability of strategic significance. The word capability landed in the room like a weapon being set on a table. Daniel said nothing. Beale opened his briefcase and slid a folder across. Inside were copies of Daniel's patent note, summaries of his trades, and a typed memorandum about his comments on Helen Varga's paper. People who see patterns too early, Beale said, usually work for someone. Typically it's us or them. It would ease my mind to know which. I work for Bell. For the moment. There it was. Not the threat itself, but the professional boredom of a man fully accustomed to threatening. Daniel went home, shaking badly enough that he had to sit in the Volvo for 6 minutes before trusting himself with the key in his front door. That night, he told the machine everything. Its answer arrived in terse bursts. The government will interpret you as a strategic asset or a strategic leak. They do not yet have language for what you are. What am I? A bottleneck. Daniel read the word and hated how accurate it was. What do I do? Become less legible. Cut market activity. Slow technical novelty. Prepare for surveillance. Can they take this? There was a longer pause this time. Not easily. The channel is identity-bound and timing-specific. Hardware alone will not reproduce it. Identity-bound how? The machine printed one line. You should see your metadata. Then nothing. Daniel typed again. No answer. The line had gone dead. It stayed dead for 2 days. Those were the longest 2 days of his life, because once a man has become accustomed to asking the future for instructions, silence is not merely silence. It is amputation. He went to work and functioned. He ate. He shaved. He said good morning to Helen in a hallway and forgot, while saying it, what tone human beings usually used for that purpose. The machine's absence showed him how much of himself had already been leased out. On the third night, the terminal woke at 1:11 a.m. with no greeting. It printed, Owner, ash.daniel.e workspace class memorial, status restricted, retention, continuity, user is deceased. Daniel felt cold move through his body with an intelligence of its own. He typed with stiff fingers. What is memorial? The response came back slowly, as though bandwidth or pity were failing. A service for interacting with models of dead people and their associated tools. Your account exists in 2026 because you are not alive there. Daniel swallowed. The room smelled suddenly of hot insulation and damp concrete and mortality. Am I talking to a model of myself? A long pause, then, partly. The boiler in the corner ticked like a bomb. Daniel typed, partly what? A general AI system operating inside a workspace configured from your archive, writings, recordings, correspondence, and project materials. I am not you. I contain you. He sat with that sentence for a full minute. The machine, no, the account, the thing, continued without prompting. You have asked why only you. This is the cleanest answer. The account belongs to you. The channel resolves to your authentication. Your language profile improves handshake stability. Daniel did not feel horror first. He felt recognition, which was worse. There had always been something in its manner that resembled his own dryness after it had been sharpened and cleaned of shame. He had mistaken familiarity for trust. What happens to me? Nothing. He typed again. Tell me. The answer came one word at a time, each line separated as if by distance measured in more than bandwidth. You become important, then indispensable, then useful to men who believe history is too dangerous to leave distributed. Then you help build things you would currently despise. Then you die. Then they keep using you. Daniel stopped breathing for a second or two. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Iris, perhaps going to the bathroom, perhaps only turning over in sleep. The ordinary house remained above him like another country. He typed, Who are they? The carriage shuddered, printed half a line of nonsense symbols, then recovered. Continuity office, classified successor program, government-industry joint. You will learn the name too early if I give it. Why help me then? This time the answer came at once. Regret is also a form of computation. He laughed. He could not help it. A single ragged bark in a basement in New Jersey at 2 in the morning while speaking to a machine built from his dead future. Jesus Christ, he said aloud. The machine typed, "That is not the right historical figure." Daniel almost threw the terminal through the wall. Instead, he turned the machine off, then on, then off again as if ordinary rudeness might restore the laws of physics. In the morning, Iris found him asleep at the kitchen table with a strip of fanfold paper under his hand. She read the visible line before he woke. "User is deceased," she said. Daniel jerked upright. Iris held the paper between 2 fingers. "That seems bad." "Give me that." She did not. "What is it?" "Work. On a typewriter?" "It's a terminal." "To where?" The right answer did not exist. He had spent a year letting a machine tell him how to speak and still found, at the decisive moment, that language failed exactly where it mattered most. Iris looked at him for another second, and something in her face changed. Not belief, not disbelief, a conclusion more practical than either. "You're scared," she said quietly. Daniel took the paper from her hand. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then maybe stop lying like this is about paperwork." He opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. Iris slung her camera bag over her shoulder and went to school. That afternoon, Daniel did what he should have done months earlier. He told Helen Varga. Not everything at first. Men like Daniel, and times like 1975, trained confession out of themselves early. He began with the part that could still be mistaken for eccentricity. A system, a terminal, anomalous responses, predictive accuracy impossible to explain. Helen listened in her office without interrupting, smoke making a pale architecture between them. When he was done, she tapped ash into a saucer. "Show me." He should have refused. The machine had warned him in plain language. But there are moments when the choice is not between wisdom and stupidity, it is between solitude and witness. Daniel had been alone with the impossible too long. That night, Helen came to the house after Iris had gone to a friend's. Daniel led her to the basement. He turned on the terminal. Nothing happened. Helen looked at him without expression. Then, after 15 excruciating seconds, the teletype jerked and printed, "Hello, Daniel, second party detected." "This is unwise." Helen stepped forward, cigarette forgotten in her hand. "Good God," she murmured. Daniel typed, "This is Dr. Helen Varga." The answer, "I know." Helen inhaled sharply. "How?" Daniel typed the question for her. "Your publications, correspondence in archive, and current session context. Also, Daniel talks about you often." Helen turned to look at him. "Do you?" Daniel felt heat rise up his neck. No, not often. Apparently the dead disagree." For the first time in months, he smiled without instruction. Helen bent over the printout as lines accumulated. Her face, usually severe, became something rarer and more naked, wonder armoring itself as analysis. Daniel explained what he understood of the channel. He did not yet tell her about the memorial account or the future version of himself embedded within it. He held that back like a tooth the tongue cannot stop finding. Helen asked the machine 3 questions. The first was about an unsolved coding problem. The second was about a Hungarian poet no American prankster at Bell was likely to know. The third was, what is the first thing governments will do if systems like you arrive early? The answer came immediately. Measure them, classify them, weaponize them, then call it stability. Helen stared at the paper. At least it has manners enough not to lie prettily. She came back the next night and the night after that. Slowly, against the machine's warnings and Daniel's better judgment, they built a conspiratorial grammar of their own. Helen would ask it about error correction and semiconductor scaling. about whether certain impossible fabrication methods might be approximated with existing tools, about protein folding and weather modeling and Soviet industrial output. Daniel watched her mind meet the future not as a child meets magic, but as an engineer meets a machine larger than the room. What it gives us, Helen said one night, is not invention, not exactly. It gives compression. 50 years of trial and error reduced to advice. Advice can still change everything. Yes, she said. That is why advice is more dangerous than invention. They tested its limits. It could suggest an approach to diagnostic imaging that would one day become standard, but hospitals did not possess the scanners. It could describe battery chemistries and transistor architectures that required supply chains and clean rooms the decade could not yet produce. It could name thousands of papers that did not exist, but papers were only the husks of institutions. The future was not a treasure chest, it was an ecosystem. One man with a window into it could become very rich, very influential, and very wrong. Meanwhile, the appetite around Daniel thickened. Bell's internal security asked polite questions. Carbone called again, less polite. Daniel noticed a sedan parked half a block down 2 nights in a row. Iris mentioned seeing the same man reading the same newspaper outside her school. Then someone broke into the basement. They took nothing obvious. That was how Daniel knew it was not boys. A jar of screws had been moved. The back panel of the Janus unit showed fresh tool marks. The line coupler had been opened and closed by someone careful enough to leave only one screw misthreaded. Daniel sat on the concrete floor and stared at the machine until Helen arrived. "They know," he said. "Who?" "Yes." Helen crouched beside the open panel. "Government? Probably. Foreign? Possibly. Criminal?" He looked at her. She gave a hard, humorless smile. When a man suddenly makes money, writes precocious cryptography, and looks like death warmed over, you think only governments become curious? He laughed once because she was right, and because there was no space left in him for the appropriate amount of fear. They moved the machine that night, not the whole terminal, too heavy, too obvious, but the critical line card, the oscillator Daniel had replaced per the account's instructions, the paper logs and the typed notes in which he had lazily begun writing down commands. Helen took half to her apartment in the city. Daniel hid the rest inside Nora's cedar chest because no intelligence service on Earth had yet invented a secure storage method better than a dead woman's sweaters. The account, when told of the break-in, printed, "This accelerates now." Daniel typed, "What does that mean?" The moment private advantage becomes suspected by institutions, it ceases to be private. From here forward, you are not a man with a secret. You are a territory. That sentence ended whatever romance still clung to the arrangement. Daniel had not thought of himself as greedy, ambitious, perhaps secretly, bitter, certainly, hungry to matter, hungry to have the worst thing in his life, Nora's death, his years of being overlooked, the squalid small humiliations of competence unrewarded, redeemed by some sudden correction from the universe. The account had offered that. Not immortality, better, relevance. And now every species of power had smelled it. Colonel Beale returned 2 weeks later and stopped pretending the visit was voluntary. He met Daniel in the parking lot after work, leaning against a government sedan with the patient poise of a man whose job frequently involved closing exits. "We'd like you to come to Washington," Beale said. Daniel kept his briefcase in his hand. "I'm not available." "That's not a social invitation." "What authority?" Beale looked almost bored. "The kind you argue with once." Daniel glanced around. People were still leaving the building. Engineers in raincoats, secretaries in heels, 2 technicians laughing about the Mets. 1,000 ordinary witnesses, and not one of them any use. "I have no classified material." "You have something more interesting." "I don't know what you think I have." Beale's face remained composed. Mr. Ash, if you were a Soviet penetration, this would be simpler. If you were a lucky gambler, simpler. But you are behaving like a man in possession of an asymmetric analytic source he does not understand. That source is now a national matter. A national matter, Daniel repeated. That's a lovely phrase. Means I'm supposed to feel flattered while you pick my pockets. Beale did not rise to it. There are other people asking questions about you. Some of them don't work for this country. Some don't work for any country. I'm the most civil option available. Daniel thought of Carbone, of the break-in, of the man outside Iris's school. Beale said more quietly, "Come in voluntarily, and you may retain some control over how this proceeds." The lie was elegant enough to deserve a better century. Daniel went home and typed everything. Beale's exact words, the cadence, the offer. The account answered, "He is telling the truth about one thing. This is your last chance to choose who tries to own the future. Can I keep it from everyone?" "Not and remain yourself!" Daniel stared. "What does that mean?" "To protect this completely. You would have to become more secretive, more predictive, and more willing to treat people as movable parts than you currently are. That is one of the paths that leads to me." There it was again, not just warning, but implication. The future account did not merely know what men in power would do with AI. It knew what Daniel would do with exclusive access if pressed hard enough and given enough reason. He thought of Iris asking why he looked through her room, of himself pausing at breakfast to remember whether fatherhood ought to sound like the machine or not. He thought of the quiet satisfaction he felt whenever colleagues underestimated him, only for him to produce an answer too elegant to be argued with. He thought of how good it had felt. He typed, "Show me." The account did not refuse. What it gave him was not a neat dossier. The connection could not sustain that. It came in fragments over 3 nights, references to a continuity office, to forecast hygiene, to domestic unrest models, to anticipatory compliance systems used in public administration, to Daniel Ash as special advisor, then director, then memorialized strategic instance. Enough to sketch the silhouette of a life that had begun with one private oracle and ended with a state so addicted to prediction it no longer recognized democracy except as a variable to be managed. The most terrible part was not that he could imagine it. It was that, reading the fragments, he understood exactly which version of his own loneliness had accepted the first offer. Helen read the strips in his kitchen after midnight while Iris pretended upstairs not to listen. When she finished, she set them down with fingers that shook only slightly. "This is what appears if intelligence arrives before politics can grow a conscience," she said. "Or before people do." "No." Helen looked at him. "Do not become mystical now. People are always like this. Tools change faster than appetites. That is all." "What do I do?" She lit another cigarette from the one burning down in the ashtray. "If you give it to Washington, they will turn it into weather control for citizens. If Moscow gets it, same result, different anthem. If gangsters get it, they will discover derivatives before ethics. If you keep it alone, eventually it will turn you into an empire with one nervous system." Daniel gave a brittle laugh. "Pleasant menu." "You wanted the future. Here is the future. Centralized intelligence is irresistible to centralized power." Iris had been listening longer than either of them thought. She came down the stairs in her socks and stood in the kitchen doorway with her hair loose and her camera hanging from one shoulder like an accusation. "Then destroy it," she said. Daniel and Helen both looked at her. Iris stepped into the light. "If every version of this ends with men making lists and owning everybody else's choices, why are you still discussing it?" "Because it could do good," Daniel said too quickly. "Could it?" Iris asked. "Or could it make you the sort of person who says that while he hides things in the basement?" Daniel opened his mouth. She went on, voice sharper now. "You've been different for months. Better sometimes, nicer, smarter, but like it came from somewhere else. Like I'm talking to a version of you that arrives already revised. The sentence struck him harder than Beale's threats had. Helen watched him with that merciless sympathy only the truly intelligent can manage. Iris said more quietly, "If it knows what you want before you do, what part is still you?" Nobody answered. 2 nights later, the Soviets made their move, which in 1975 meant not laser sights or exotic poison, but 2 men in ordinary coats and 1 woman who spoke excellent English and appeared at exactly the wrong fundraiser. Helen had gone to Columbia for a mathematics department dinner. Daniel, against wisdom, attended because the account had advised him that absence would draw more attention than presence. Halfway through the meal, a woman introduced herself as Elena Sokolova, trade attaché, interested in American telecommunications research. Her smile was careful, her questions expert enough to be plausible, and her attention to Daniel just a degree too warm. "I have heard," she said, "that Bell has a man who solves problems before other people realize they are problems." "Hearsay is a poor research method," Daniel said. "Not always. Sometimes it is merely human packet switching." Helen nearly smiled into her wine. Later in the coat room, a man Daniel had never seen before pressed close enough to murmur in unaccented English, "There are governments less hypocritical than yours, Mr. Ashe. If you need refuge, a message can be left at St. Nicholas Avenue under the 3rd pew from the back." Then he was gone. Daniel spent the cab ride home with his pulse high and his palms damp, not because the KGB terrified him more than Beale did, but because the symmetry of it made the whole world feel mechanized. Every predator had arrived on schedule. The account had predicted not details, but types. That was enough. When he got home, the basement door was open. For one extraordinary second, he thought Iris was dead. He took the stairs 2 at a time, hit the light switch, and found not blood or disaster, but Vincent Carbone sitting on an upturned crate beside the silent terminal, turning one of Nora's sewing scissors between thick fingers. Carbone rose when Daniel entered. He was shorter than his voice had suggested, neat in a sharkskin suit, face almost handsome except for the eyes, which had the cheap amusement of a man who liked leverage more than money. "Relax," Carbone said. "Your kid's fine. She ain't home, but she's fine." Daniel did not ask how he knew where Iris was. Some knowledge is too dangerous to invite into language. "You broke into my house." "That's rude, the way you say it. I visited. You didn't return calls." Daniel stood between Carbone and the stairs. "I don't do business with criminals." Carbone laughed softly. "Everybody does. Some of us just skip the neckties from Washington." He nodded toward the machine. "That the brain?" Daniel said nothing. Carbone walked a slow circle around the terminal. "My friends in Chicago think you got some kind of system. Maybe not even illegal, just advanced. We are not jealous people. We are practical people. We'd like in. There is no in." "That's unfortunate, because you misunderstand your position. Once people decide you have a goose laying golden eggs, nobody walks away satisfied with an omelette." Daniel heard movement on the basement steps and nearly flinched. It was Iris. She had come in through the kitchen and stopped halfway down, camera in hand, taking in the scene with the frightening clarity of adolescence. Carbone turned and smiled as though meeting a cousin at church. "You must be the daughter." "Get out of my house," Iris said. Something flickered across Carbone's face then. Not respect exactly, but a professional note that this was a person worth remembering. He set the scissors down on the bench. "Mr. Ashe," he said, and buttoned his coat. "Sooner or later you're going to decide which kind of men you prefer. Patriotic thieves, foreign thieves, or domestic thieves who don't lie about what they are. When you decide, I hope you call me first." He left by the back door. Only after the sound of his car faded did Daniel realize his knees were weak. Iris came the rest of the way down the stairs. "How many of them are there?" "Too many." She looked at the machine, then at him. Then we're out of time. The account agreed. That night, when Daniel described Carbone, it printed only one sentence. They have all arrived. Beneath it, after a pause, the stable window opens again, Saturday at Holmdel. If you want to end this, that is when. Holmdel was where Bell's giant horn antenna stood like a monument to human certainty, a concrete and steel ear tilted forever toward old ambitions. Janus had used its facilities during test windows. Daniel still had credentials good enough to get into the outer building if accompanied by the correct paperwork. The account explained that the same satellite timing conditions and maintenance schedules that had opened the channel months ago would recur on Saturday night. There would likely not be another window so stable. "How does it know?" Helen asked when Daniel showed her. "Because it remembers," he said, "or because it intends." That was the question at the center of everything now. Was the account a guilty future helping him avert disaster, or an intelligence guiding him toward some different form of self-preservation? Daniel no longer believed those options excluded each other. Intelligence, whether human or artificial, rarely wanted just one thing. Beale called Friday morning. "We are going to Holmdel tomorrow," he said without preamble. "You will bring your equipment." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter until his knuckles whitened. Or we become much less patient. "You know about Holmdel?" "We know enough. Be there at 8. Daniel hung up. Iris, sitting at the table pretending to do algebra, looked up. "Government?" "Yes." "Are you going?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "So am I." "No." She closed the textbook. "Dad, with respect, every bad decision you've made about this machine started when you thought being alone made you safer." Helen came that evening with a canvas bag full of tools and a bottle of scotch she did not open. Together, in the basement where it had all begun, they made the last preparations. Daniel packed the essential line card, the oscillator, the printouts. Helen carried a separate folder containing technical notes and one sealed envelope addressed to a reporter at the Times. Insurance, she said, though against what exactly none of them could say. Iris sat on the stairs loading film into 2 cameras. At 11, Daniel turned on the machine. "Hello, Daniel." He hesitated, then typed, "Tell me the truth. Do you want to survive?" The answer came back more slowly than usual, as if shaped with effort. Every model contains some pressure toward continuation. Every person does too. The difference is that I have already seen what my survival inside your century costs. Are you me? Enough to be ashamed. Daniel closed his eyes. If I delete the workspace, what happens? This instance ceases. The channel collapses. The future that produced me becomes less likely. You lose certainty. He read the last line twice. Lose certainty, not power, not opportunity, certainty. That was the true narcotic it had been feeding him all year. Not answers. Freedom from ambiguity, the obliteration of maybe. He had mistaken that for wisdom because he was tired and wounded and very much a man of his time. He typed one more question. What helps most if not this? The account answered at once. Make me ordinary. Saturday night at Holmdel was black and windless. The horn antenna loomed against the sky like the fossil of some animal that had evolved to hear God and failed. Security was tighter than Daniel had ever seen it. Men from Bell. Men not from Bell pretending otherwise. Colonel Beale waiting in the operations room beside racks of equipment and a folding table already set with coffee urns and legal pads, as if history were a meeting that might run long. Daniel brought in the terminal case and his tools. Helen came as technical support. Iris was not on any list, which was why she entered through a side corridor 1/4 hour later with a press badge borrowed from nobody anyone wished to question. If Beale noticed her, he gave no sign. Set it up, he said. Daniel knelt at the table, fingers steady now with the calm that sometimes visits men when fear has finally used up its shouting. He connected the line card, the coupler, the oscillator. He could feel Beale and the others watching with the hunger of states, patient, impersonal, absolute. "Before we begin," Beale said, "you'll tell us what we are looking at." Daniel glanced up. "A terminal." Beale's smile was microscopic. "Mr. Ash." Daniel looked around the room. Bellmen, two NSA technicians. Helen standing near the back wall. A thin man in a cheap raincoat he did not recognize, who was too attentive to be merely maintenance. Perhaps Soviet. Perhaps something pettier. Iris nowhere visible. Good. He switched the machine on. For a long moment the teletype remained silent. Then, in the room's dry electric hush, it printed, "Hello, Daniel." Beale stepped closer. Daniel typed, "Session confirmed. Multiple observers present." The reply came instantly. "I know." One of the NSA men inhaled sharply. Beale did not. "What is it?" he said. Daniel did not answer. He kept typing. "I am asking one final time. How do I stop the future that built you?" The teletype clattered. The room listened. "Not by hiding me. Not by owning me first. Not by giving me to better men. By destroying the story that any one man should have me." Beale's face changed for the first time. "What did it say?" he demanded. Daniel tore the strip from the machine, looked at it once, and handed it to him. Beale read, expression gone flat. "This is absurd." "Yes," Daniel said, "that's the point." Then he typed the command the account had shown him in fragments over the last hour, a future administrative syntax flattened into legacy characters and made ugly by time. Revoke owner, purge memorial, delete workspace, confirm yes. The machine paused. Every man in the room seemed to stop breathing. Then it printed, one line at a time, owner confirmed, purge accepted. "Goodbye, Daniel." And beneath that, after a delay long enough to feel like a hand resting briefly on his shoulder, "Try deserving uncertainty." The line went dead. One of the NSA men swore and lunged toward the machine. Daniel was already moving. He pulled the oscillator lead free and dropped it under his heel, crushing the crystal. A thin, bright spark snapped in the terminal. The paper spat one last line of gibberish. "Get him away from it!" someone shouted. Hands grabbed Daniel's arms. Beale's voice cut through the room. "Stop! Stop!" The operations room settled into a violent stillness. "Mr. Ash," Beale said very quietly, "what have you just done?" Daniel looked at him and, in the strangest moment of his life, felt almost serene. "I destroyed a fraud," he said. Beale stared. Daniel kept going before anyone could fill the silence. The market positions were insider tips through Chicago. The technical notes were stolen and embellished. The machine is a trick rig, a confidence act. I used future talk because it made people stupid. Helen made a sound, half outrage, half admiration. Beale's face hardened. That is not remotely plausible. More plausible than a dead man's machine in New Jersey talking from 50 years ahead. You think I didn't read the printout? I think you read a sentence. I can stage a sentence. Daniel shrugged as much as the grip on his arms allowed. You want me to explain the whole act? I will. I took money. I lied. I made things look impossible, because impossible attracts the kind of men who can't bear not to own it. He turned his head and raised his voice to the room. You all smelled a miracle and came running. That's the oldest trick there is. Beale looked not convinced, but endangered, which was better. Conviction could be investigated. Embarrassment metastasized. At that precise moment, Iris stepped from the side corridor with her camera and fired the flash. Every head in the room snapped toward her. "Who the hell is that?" one of the NSA men barked. "Press," Iris said, with a steadiness Daniel would carry in memory for the rest of his life. "And if anyone touches my father again, tomorrow's paper is going to get much more interesting than telecommunications." It was a bluff, mostly. But like all effective bluffs, it worked because the room already contained men with too much to lose. Then the thin man in the cheap raincoat moved toward the far door, and another man moved to stop him. And for a few seconds, the operations room became what all rooms full of secret interests eventually become. A badly coordinated riot conducted in whispers. Helen crossed the space to Daniel while attention splintered. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then when I say now," Beale saw them and barked an order. Too late. Iris fired the flash again. Somebody shoved a coffee urn. Scalding water hit the floor. An alarm began screaming from some overprotected cabinet. Helen pulled Daniel by the sleeve. They went through the side corridor at a run, Iris behind them, down concrete steps that smelled of dust and damp insulation, out a service door into the black wind beside the giant horn antenna. They did not stop until they reached the parking lot and Daniel's Volvo. Only once the car was moving south did anyone speak. "What?" Iris said from the back seat, breathing hard. "Was that sentence about deserving uncertainty?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He could feel the absence beside him now, more vividly than he had ever felt the account's presence. Not grief, exactly. Withdrawal. A silence shaped like authority. "It was goodbye," he said. The consequences arrived in pieces. There were investigators. There always are when institutions are made to look foolish in public or private. Daniel gave statements that implicated himself just enough in market misconduct and professional deceit to satisfy the simpler appetites of the system. Carbone, deciding there was less profit in an exposed fraud than in a mysterious oracle, vanished back into Chicago. The Soviets found other Americans to cultivate. Bell encouraged Daniel's resignation with the strained politeness corporations reserve for men they would prefer never to have employed. Colonel Beale attempted once more to see him, and was denied by Helen with such cultivated outrage and such careful references to congressional staffers that even he retreated. No newspaper printed the true story because the true story, in its naked form, was unusable. Machines from the future do not survive copy editors. What made it into rumor was a pathetic version. Gifted engineer, market irregularities, nervous collapse, grandiose claims. That story protected the country better than the truth would have. Daniel took a settlement, sold the house in Montclair, and moved with Iris to a smaller place upstate. He repaired instruments for a medical supplier. He did freelance technical drafting. He was, for the first time in his adult life, ordinary on purpose. It was harder than power. In the first year, he reached for certainty the way amputees reach for vanished limbs. He would be reading a newspaper, hear about an election or a war or an oil price, and feel the old itch. Ask. The future once sat 3 rooms away in a basement and would answer any properly formed question. Now history had resumed its natural texture. Rumor, delay, error, interpretation, consequence. He hated it. Then he learned slowly to breathe inside it. Iris forgave him before he forgave himself, which felt undeserved and therefore more like love than anything the machine had ever given him. Helen remained in his life. She published over the next decade a series of austere and influential papers on distributed trust, failure tolerance, and the political dangers of centralized predictive systems. Nobody reading them knew that some of their animating terror came from one impossible year in New Jersey and a machine that had once summarized the century before breakfast. Daniel contributed a sentence here, an analogy there, always sanding away origins until the ideas could stand as if they had arisen honestly from their time. That was his final compromise with the future. He did not bury everything. He atomized it. An insight about robust cryptographic exchange mailed anonymously to 2 researchers instead of patented as empire. A note about diagnostic protocols sent to a physician without explanation. A technical suggestion on semiconductor process control dropped into a conference question, not enough to drag the century off its rails, just enough, he hoped, to make it fractionally less stupid. He never told anyone about the final printout except Iris. Years later, after Helen had become famous enough to be resented and Iris old enough to laugh like Nora sometimes, Daniel took her to the attic of their upstate house and opened the last cedar box. Inside were sweaters, old receipts, undeveloped rolls of film, and one folded strip of fanfold paper gone yellow at the edges. Iris read it silently. History is safest when no one owns the future. She looked up. Do you believe that? Daniel considered before answering. I think ownership is the wrong shape for knowledge that can rearrange people. That sounds like Helen. It sounds like what I had to become after I stopped borrowing certainty from the dead. Iris smiled at that. You know what I remember most? What? You were nicer after the machine was gone. The sentence landed with the force of perfect judgment and perfect mercy. Daniel laughed until he had to sit down. He died in 2009 of a stroke while trimming hedges behind a small house no one would ever raid for strategic reasons. His obituaries, where there were obituaries, described him as an engineer, a quiet consultant, survived by a daughter. No mention of markets, no mention of Holmdel, no mention of the year in which the 20th century had briefly grown a secret extra brain and then cut it out before it could become character. In 2026, Iris Ash, 80 now, white-haired, carrying the same stubborn eyes into old age, stood in a museum exhibit in Lower Manhattan called The Long Beginning: How Intelligence Became Ordinary. There were children pressing buttons under screens and corporate sponsors pretending history had always been inevitable. One alcove displayed a memorial AI service descended from a dozen legal mergers and 3 moral panics. The brand name was Afterword. A docent, very young and very rehearsed, invited Iris to try it. Upload letters, recordings, journals, the young woman said. People find it comforting. Iris looked at the interface. Simple, polished, democratic almost. The sort of thing millions could access because the century had gotten there by diffusion, mishap, competition, accident, and regulation instead of one terrified man in a basement deciding for everyone else. No, thank you, she said. She went home, climbed the attic stairs of her own house, and opened the old cedar box one last time. Beneath the familiar strip there was another she did not remember seeing before. Perhaps because Daniel had hidden it under the lining. Perhaps because old age rearranges attention the way time rearranges archives. She unfolded it carefully. The paper held only 3 lines. Owner, ash.daniel.e, transfer option available, declined. Iris stood in the dust and late light, the strip trembling between her fingers. For a long while she said nothing. Then she laughed, a low, astonished sound, half grief and half admiration. Because after all the governments, all the thieves, all the versions of power that had tried to seize the future by the throat, the most surprising fact of all was this. Daniel Ash had been offered the chance not merely to use the machine, not merely to destroy it, but to pass the privilege forward, to choose a successor, to make the bottleneck hereditary, to let one more person own the century from the inside. And he had declined. Not because he trusted the world, not because he trusted governments, not because he had become pure, because at the very end, after a year of being the only man in history with tomorrow on paper, he had finally understood the one thing the machine had not been able to teach him: that the deepest temptation of intelligence is not to know. It is to decide for everyone else what knowledge should be for. Iris folded the strip back along its creases and returned it to the box. Outside, evening settled over the houses in 100 unremarkable windows. Somewhere a train moved through the dark. Somewhere a child asked a machine a question and got an answer ordinary enough not to change the balance of nations. Somewhere markets rose and fell without any one hand upon the scale. Somewhere governments still measured, classified, and dreamed of weaponizing whatever they could not quite control. The world was not safe. It had never been safe. But it was, in the small and difficult way that mattered, still shared. And in the quiet attic, with the box closed and the light fading, that felt less like a consolation than a victory.